"They're all I've got left," Henry muttered as he gently laid his war medals on the pawn shop counter. After half a century of holding onto pride, hunger had finally taken the upper hand. The decorated Vietnam veteran walked out with just enough cash to buy some groceries. But everything was about to change because at the break of dawn, a renowned chef would show up and shift the course of his life. "Hi everyone, welcome to Life Tales. Let's dive in." Henry Lawson stood quietly, staring at the empty spots on his living room wall. For years, his Marine Corps medals had hung there with honor: the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Vietnam Service Medal. Now only faint, discolored rectangles remained, ghostly outlines on the wallpaper where history had once proudly rested. At 76, Henry never thought he'd reach a point where he'd have to let go of the symbols that defined his service. But when the choice is between preserving honor or putting food on the table, survival has a way of silencing pride. His military pension and Social Security just weren't cutting it anymore, not with his prescriptions eating up nearly $400 a month after his supplemental insurance collapsed. $47, the pawn shop owner had said, sliding the cash across the counter. "That's the best I can offer." Henry had nodded silently, his throat too tight to respond. He knew the medals were worth far more, even just as raw material, but he was in no position to bargain. His last savings had gone into fixing the busted furnace a few weeks back. Henry's modest ranch house stood at the edge of Millerton, a town that had seen its heyday vanish when the factory shut down. He and his late wife, Grace, had bought it after he came home from Vietnam. Henry spent the next 30 years working at the steel mill until retirement. They never had kids. The doctors blamed Agent Orange for that. Still, they'd built a life together, a quiet, decent one, until cancer claimed Grace 3 years earlier. Now it was just Henry and his memories and a pantry that grew barer by the week. He shuffled into the kitchen and carefully unpacked the handful of groceries he'd been able to afford: a single loaf of bread, a package of bologna, 5 cans of soup, and a bag of bruised apples that had been marked down. If he rationed wisely, it might stretch 2 weeks. He'd gone hungry before, deep in the jungle. He knew how to push through hunger. He'd do it again. As he tucked away the final can, his eyes landed on the small TV perched in the kitchen corner. The evening news was featuring a well-known chef who'd made it big with a string of restaurants before becoming a TV personality. According to the caption, his name was Dominic Russo, and he was promoting a new food truck project aimed at delivering gourmet meals to struggling communities. "Food's not just fuel," Russo said, his thick New York accent untouched by his time in Hollywood. "It's dignity. It's connection. No one should have to choose between buying medication or having a proper meal." Henry snorted and clicked off the TV. Easy to say when you've never had your stomach growl for 3 days straight. He made himself a bologna sandwich, cut it neatly in half to save some for tomorrow, and ate in silence. The house was already getting cold, but he decided to hold off on the heat. The military blankets in the hall closet were still thick enough. That night, sleep came in fits. His dreams carried him back to rice paddies, to gunfire, to the weary faces of the men he'd served with. Like clockwork, Henry was awake at dawn, a habit the years had never broken. His back ached as he stepped to the front window to check the sky. Then he heard it, the unmistakable whup 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 of helicopter blades slicing the morning stillness. His body tensed instinctively, reflexes sharpened by war, never dulled. Moving quickly to the window, he spotted a gleaming white helicopter descending into the empty field next to his house. It was a restored Bell UH-1 Huey, the kind he hadn't seen up close in decades, proudly marked with Russo's Flying Kitchen across the side. The sight struck him like a lightning bolt. How many wounded had he helped load into birds just like that one? A black SUV pulled into his driveway behind the chopper. From both vehicles, a small group emerged, and among them there was no mistaking the familiar face of the chef he'd seen on the news the night before. Henry blinked hard, wondering if this was another dream. Still in his robe and slippers, he shuffled to the front door and opened it cautiously. "Mr. Lawson?" the chef called, turning toward the sound. "Henry Lawson?" "That's me," Henry answered slowly, eyes narrowing in confusion. "What's going on here?" Dominic Russo walked toward him, extending a hand. In person, he looked older than on screen. Laugh lines around his eyes told the story of a man who smiled often. "Sir, I'm Dominic Russo. I was hoping we could have a conversation." Henry took the hand automatically, old habits from the service still strong, though his mind was still trying to catch up. "About what?" he asked. "And how do you even know my name?" Russo motioned to a young man standing quietly behind him. This is my nephew, Lucas. He's the reason we're here. Lucas stepped forward, carefully revealing something in his palm. Henry's breath hitched when he saw it, his bronze star. You bought my medal? Henry asked, a sharp edge of anger cutting through his confusion. Not exactly, sir, Lucas replied quickly, sensing the tension. I've been looking for you for almost a year. My grandfather left behind some letters that talked about a Sergeant Lawson who saved his life in Vietnam. When he passed, I made it my mission to find you. I've been searching pawn shop records across 3 states looking for any military medals with your name. He looked Henry in the eyes. When this one showed up in the system at Universal Pawns here in Millerton, I knew I'd finally found you. Henry's brow furrowed as the past began pressing in hard. Your grandfather? Henry asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Charles Russo, Lucas replied softly. He served with the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines in Vietnam. He used to tell us about the staff sergeant who carried him 3 miles through the jungle after he was wounded all the way to a medevac site. Lucas's voice dropped to a more reverent tone. That was you, wasn't it? For a moment, Henry felt the ground shift beneath him. The name Charles Russo unleashed a flood of memories, a wiry kid from Brooklyn, barely 19, hit during a sudden ambush near Khe Sanh. Henry hadn't thought about him in decades. Back then, you didn't dwell on acts of bravery, you just did what needed to be done for your men. He made it home? Henry asked, the words catching in his throat. Dominic nodded, eyes glistening. He did. He lived until he was 78. Passed away 3 years ago. Raised 5 kids, had 12 grandkids. And every single Thanksgiving he told us the story of the sergeant who saved his life. He paused for a moment, letting that sink in. Lucas has been digging through military archives, veterans forums, service databases, everything. When he finally linked your medal to the letters my grandfather left behind. Henry glanced at the white Huey outside. That helicopter. It's a restored UH-1, Dominic confirmed. We use it on my show, Flying Kitchen. We travel to underserved communities to deliver meals. When we confirmed it was really you, I told the production team we were flying straight here. I couldn't explain it, it just felt urgent. Like we had to make it right. Henry stared out the window again. The helicopter stirred something deep in him, something that hadn't surfaced in years. I loaded more wounded into birds like that than I can count, he murmured. My grandfather was one of them, Dominic said gently. He came home because of you, which means our entire family exists because of what you did. He motioned to Lucas. Go ahead. Show him. Lucas stepped forward and held out the bronze star. This belongs to you, sir. I've brought it back. Henry's gaze locked on the medal. Feelings he'd long buried came surging to the surface, pride, grief, something close to shame. You keep it, he said hoarsely. I let it go fair and square. Dominic shook his head. No, sir. You didn't just sell a medal, you sold a piece of your life, your honor, because you couldn't afford food. That's not how this should work. Lucas added, we pulled your service file when we were searching for you. We know what you did over there. Henry turned away, uneasy under the weight of their eyes. What's with the chopper anyway? He asked, trying to change the subject. Dominic offered a small smile. I was hoping you'd ask. Mind if we come in? There's something important I'd like to discuss. 30 minutes later, Henry found himself seated at his kitchen table with Dominic and Lucas. A tray of fresh pastries and hot coffee sat between them, brought in straight from the helicopter. Henry had grumbled that he had nothing to offer his unexpected guests, but Dominic had waved him off. So, let me get this straight, Henry said, slowly wrapping his hands around the mug. You want to put me on your show? Dominic nodded earnestly. My grandfather always said the best meals are the ones with stories behind them. When Lucas finally tracked you down through that medal and we learned about your circumstances, it all lined up with a segment I've been planning, Heroes Kitchens. We highlight veterans and the meals that help them cope, during deployment or after coming home. Henry shook his head lightly. I'm no hero, and I'm definitely not a chef. Dominic smiled. To someone, every veteran is a hero. And as it turns out, we found records showing you took over kitchen duty for your unit for almost 2 months when your cook was injured. Your commanding officer even wrote about how you kept morale up with some pretty creative cooking, despite almost no supplies. Henry let out a quiet chuckle. Creative's one word for it. We called it jungle surprise. Half the time, even I wasn't sure what we were eating. That's exactly what makes it compelling, Dominic said, enthusiasm lighting up his face. People need to hear stories like yours. How food kept people grounded in the middle of chaos. How it brought comfort in the worst of times. Outside, production staff were busy setting up around the field where the helicopter had landed. Dominic explained they wanted to film some initial footage, maybe interview Henry about his experiences if he felt up to it. There's also a stipend, Dominic added casually. $10,000, that's what we pay our featured guests. Henry froze mid-sip, staring over the rim of his mug. 10,000. Yep, Dominic said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. And we'd also handle any home repairs you need before filming the main segment. New appliances, countertops, whatever. One part of the show is upgrading the veterans' kitchen so they can recreate their dishes properly. Henry set his cup down, overwhelmed. He looked Dominic square in the eyes. Why me? I'm sure there are other vets out there with more charisma or better stories. Dominic held Henry's gaze without flinching. 3 reasons, he said calmly. First, you saved my grandfather's life. Without you, I wouldn't even be here. Second, your life, your sacrifice, both in uniform and out, deserves to be seen and recognized. And third, he paused, choosing his next words with care. Before my grandfather passed, he made me promise, if Lucas ever found the sergeant who carried him to safety, I would make sure we repaid that debt. Lucas reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out 2 more medals, Henry's Purple Heart and his Vietnam Service Medal. We tracked these down too, sir, Lucas said gently. They're yours. All of them should be with you. Henry stared down at the medals, his throat tightening. It had been a long time since anyone had honored his service, even longer since he'd felt like he still mattered to anyone. He hadn't felt part of anything, not since Grace's funeral. The neighborhood had come together then, offering support, food, and condolences. But over time, the visits stopped. The calls faded. His financial situation worsened, and with it came silence, isolation slowly wrapping itself around him like a second skin. For 3 long years, he'd been retreating, vanishing a little more with each passing month. There's something else, Dominic said, sliding a folder across the table. This part isn't connected to the show. It's a job offer if you're open to it. Henry gave him a skeptical look before flipping the folder open. Inside was a formal letter offering him a position as a consultant for Russo's Veterans Culinary Program, a training initiative that helped fellow veterans learn cooking skills as they transitioned into civilian life. You said earlier you're not much of a cook, Dominic added, but that's not the point. You know how to improvise, how to get by with very little. You've cooked in the worst conditions imaginable. These younger vets, they don't just need recipes. They need the mindset, the grit, the resilience. Henry let out a dry laugh. I'm 76, Dominic. What could an old guy like me possibly teach anyone? Dominic smiled warmly. My grandfather was still teaching us lessons from his time in Vietnam right up until the day he passed. Some lessons you only learn after decades of living. You've got that kind of wisdom. He paused for a moment, then added, the job includes health coverage, and not just basic coverage, good insurance. Henry leaned back in his chair, taking it all in. Just that morning, he'd stared at the empty outlines on his wall where his medals used to hang. Now, not only were they being returned, but opportunities were landing in his lap that could erase the financial strain that had forced him to pawn them in the first place. I'm not looking for handouts, he said, voice firm. Dominic nodded. I know, and this isn't one. The show needs real stories from real veterans. And the culinary program? It needs mentors who understand what it means to live through both war and survival after it ends. This isn't charity, Sergeant Lawson, it's a partnership. Your experience in exchange for support you've more than earned. Outside, the crew had finished setting up a mobile kitchen next to the helicopter. The scent of cooking food was now drifting through the open window, rich, warm, inviting. We figured we'd do something special, Dominic said. Brought lunch for everyone on the block. Sort of a pop-up neighborhood cookout. People are already starting to trickle over, and let's face it, a Huey touching down in Millerton doesn't go unnoticed. Henry stepped over to the window and looked out. Sure enough, people were beginning to gather on the edges of his yard. He spotted Mrs. Holloway from across the street she used to bring him cookies around Christmas. The tailor from the corner shop was there too, their 3 kids in tow. Even Mr. Franklin had stepped outside, something Henry hadn't seen him do since his wife passed away. It had been years since Henry had felt part of anything like this. Not since Grace's service, when the whole neighborhood had shown up to grieve beside him. But after that day, life had grown quieter, and Henry had gradually folded inward, ashamed of how much he was struggling. He hadn't wanted anyone to see how far he'd fallen. Now, looking out at familiar faces returning to his yard, he felt a quiet ache, not just of loss, but of reconnection. "What exactly would you be filming today?" he asked, his voice cautious. "Just some relaxed footage," Dominic assured him. "You and me chatting about meals from your time in service. Maybe a few neighbor interactions. Nothing too formal." Henry considered it carefully. His eyes drifted back to the medals on the table, then to the growing crowd beyond his window. "And you'd really redo the whole kitchen?" he asked. "Top to bottom," Dominic confirmed. "We'll bring in new counters, modern appliances, whatever you need. It's all covered." Henry's voice lowered. That kitchen meant everything to Grace. She kept it spotless. Made magic in there, even on the leanest weeks. She'd be ashamed to see it like this. Dominic's tone softened. "Then let's bring it back to something she'd be proud of again. Maybe we even did something, a tribute, something to keep her memory in that space." That was the moment Henry made his choice. He gave a slow nod. "Okay, I'll do the interview. But the job? I'll need some time to think that over." "Absolutely," Dominic said, rising and offering his hand once more. "Thank you, Sergeant Lawson, for everything." As neighbors came and went, sampling dishes and exchanging greetings, Henry took part in several short interview segments with Dominic. He shared personal stories about how food had played a surprising role during his time in service, how one can of peaches passed around his squad during a brutal week had lifted their spirits in a way no speech could. He told of bartering cigarettes for vegetables from local farmers to stretch their limited rations. "You know," Henry said at one point, the words flowing more easily than he expected, "when you're at war, even the smallest comforts take on enormous meaning. A hot meal, after days of cold, tasteless rations, it feels like a gift from another world. Better than anything I've ever had in a five-star restaurant." Dominic nodded, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. "My grandfather used to say the same thing. He always talked about the first proper meal he had after recovering from his wounds. He called it a miracle." As the day unfolded, Henry was surprised by how much he found himself enjoying it all. The camera crew kept their distance when needed, never pressing him when he hesitated. And the neighbors he'd avoided for years, out of shame, out of silence, approached him with genuine warmth, many offering thanks for his service in a way he hadn't heard in decades. Mrs. Holloway brought out an old photo album, proudly showing a picture of her late husband, who had served in Vietnam as well, though in a different unit. The Taylor's children, wide-eyed and curious, listened intently to Henry's gentler stories, tales that didn't shy away from truth but offered hope. Even Mr. Franklin, the most reclusive of the bunch, shared that he'd once been a Navy cook during the Korean War. By the time late afternoon arrived and the crew began packing up, Henry found himself back at his kitchen table with Dominic, Lucas, and one of the production assistants. She laid out the next steps, flipping through sketches and renovation plans. The renovation team would arrive 2 weeks before the main shoot, she explained, showing Henry design concepts that preserved the character of his home while updating what needed fixing. "We'll put you in a hotel during the renovation. Everything's covered, no cost to you." Henry nodded slowly, still trying to process the whirlwind of the day. His table, once bare, now held his returned medals, an advance check for his participation, a formal show contract, and the folder containing the job offer. Dominic noticed where Henry's gaze had landed. "There's no rush," he said gently. "Take your time with the Veterans Program. It's totally separate from the show. No pressure." Henry looked up at the young chef, and for a moment he could see traces of Charles Rousseau, the same determined look, the same quiet gratitude. "Your grandfather. Did he have a favorite meal? One that brought him back to life a little?" Dominic's expression softened. "Spaghetti and meatballs. Just a simple, old-school family recipe. After Vietnam, he didn't want anything fancy, just something that reminded him of home." "I get that," Henry said quietly. "When you've spent so long away, sometimes the most ordinary things become the most sacred." As the crew wrapped up and neighbors slowly made their way home, Henry stood on the front porch, watching the bustle wind down. The Huey helicopter still sat in the field beside his house. Once a symbol of trauma, now transformed into something hopeful. Lucas approached again, holding something else. "We came across one more item, Mr. Lawson," he said, offering a small, worn frame. Inside was a faded photo, a young Henry surrounded by his unit, all of them laughing around a makeshift table deep in the jungle. "It was tucked in with the medals," Lucas explained. "Thought you might want to have it back." Henry accepted it, staring down at a piece of his past. He remembered that day, the rare feeling of lightness, the smell of real food from a surprise supply drop, the rain finally giving them a break. He had managed to cobble together a halfway decent meal, and for an hour they had laughed like boys. "Thank you," he said gruffly. "This means more than I can say." Dominic joined them just as the last of the equipment was being loaded into trucks. "We'll follow up soon to schedule the renovation and set the shoot dates," he said. "And my personal number's in that folder. If you need anything before then, seriously, anything, just reach out." Henry looked at him, one brow slightly raised. "You don't even know me." Dominic smiled. "I know enough. My grandfather got 50 extra years of life because of you. He raised a family, built a business, watched his grandkids grow up. His whole future, and mine, exists because you didn't leave him behind." He paused. "I know I'll never be able to repay that fully, but I can sure try." Once the helicopter lifted off, stirring the air with memory and motion, and the last vehicle rolled away, Henry was alone again. He sat in his living room with the medals, now back where they belonged, resting neatly on the coffee table. The photograph of his unit leaned beside them. The house felt different somehow, not just physically but spiritually, as if something lost had quietly found its way back. He picked up the job offer folder again, this time giving it his full attention. The role was flexible, part-time, mindful of his energy and health. It involved sharing stories, teaching simple cooking techniques, and mentoring younger vets learning how to transition. The compensation wasn't extravagant, but it was honest. The health insurance alone would relieve a burden he'd carried for too long. This wasn't a handout. It was exactly what Dominic had said, an exchange of value, a trade, his lived experience, for support and purpose. Henry stood and walked to the wall where his medals had once hung. One by one, he placed them back in their old spots. The empty outlines were gone. His pantry would be full again. His medications would no longer drain what little he had left. But more than any of that, something deeper had returned. A sense of purpose, a reason to wake up, people who still saw him, a neighborhood that hadn't forgotten him after all. He gently hung the photograph beside the medals, completing the wall, a tribute to where he'd been and maybe to where he was going. Tomorrow would look nothing like yesterday. And it all started with a chef landing a helicopter in his yard, carrying with him both the past and a future Henry never expected. His grandfather had been right, Henry thought to himself. Some of the best meals really do come with stories. And some of those stories take 50 years to make their way home. Enjoyed the story? Tap that like button and subscribe to Life Tales for more. And don't go just yet, the next story is waiting for you right here on screen. We'll see you soon.